Excuse me, got a bit of a frog. I have to declare, I know it's normal to declare an interest, but I have to declare an ignorance. And that is, I'm not too hot on charitable trusts around hospitals. But what I am hot on is that in 1991, I started a project called The Big Issue. And the reason I started it was because the provision that was provided by government and by charities was totally lacking. Completely and utterly lacking in one area, which I will refer to later. The reason I support this bill, where we, in a sense, give trustees their head, give them the belief that they can make changes, give them the opportunity to spend money wisely. I think the very idea of the Minister of State overseeing the charities, if I've got it right, the trusts, I would want to end that situation. So I would like to use the opportunity of my maiden speech to get behind freeing up charities and encouraging them. But as our noble lady makes the point, charities themselves need to go through some pretty thorough work. When we started The Big Issue, we ran into enormous problems from virtually all of the charities that acted in and around homelessness. I am also interested in this subject because even though I've never used Great Ormond Street Hospital, I'm a part of the West London, where Paddington Green Kids Hospital was where we went whenever we harmed ourselves. Unfortunately, it's with us no more. But I was born up around the back of where J.M. Barrie wrote Peter Pan. I'm a Notting Hill Bayswater boy, and the swings that the Llewyn Joneses played in the early part of the last century, I was playing there just after the Second World War. I should give you an introduction to who I am. Thank God I'm in the House, I have to say. I'm really pleased, and I think you will be aware of that in the period of time that comes up. I would like to thank my probation officer. My probation officer, when I was 10, stood beside me, and instead of chastising me as a post-war statistic, encouraged me to read and to write, even though it took me many years to master those arts. Encouraged me to look upon myself as not simply an underclass boy who at the age of 10 had already been banged up for a few things and been put on probation and fined and things like that. Silly little things that today they slap a child's hand and say, don't do that. But in the good old days, after the Second World War and in the 50s, they trod on you hard. I would also like to thank a wonderful woman, Baroness Wootton. Baroness Wootton was an absolute marvellous woman who, when I was 10, put me on probation. When I was 12, made me a ward of court. When I was 13, put me in a remand home. When I was 14, sent me for a short shock shop. When I was 15, took me from a boys' prison and put me back into a reformatory so I could learn to read and write. Baroness Wootton is very, very important to this house, because Baroness Wootton in 1958 became one of only 4 women who were allowed to sit in this house and broke the male domination of this house, and we should be thanked. I would love to think that if Baroness Wootton, who would be now 118, was alive, she would come running over to me and give me the biggest hug of my life. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Oh, you can do that, thank you. Anyway, sorry. The throat. I'd also like to pause for a moment and talk back to The Big Issue. When we started The Big Issue, I was rather aggressively anti-charity, because I saw a situation where there were 501 homeless organisations in London alone. And they supplied you with everything from auricular acupuncture to a place to wash your undies, to a shoulder to cry on. But one thing they did not give poor people. They did not give them the opportunity of making money. And one of the reasons they didn't give them the opportunity to make money is because of the laws around charities. Means you can give all sorts of things, but you cannot give opportunity in the form of work. I was a person who was born in the slums of post-war London, brought up a Catholic racist. I'm not having a go at the Catholics. Brought up to hate black people, Jewish people, and even English people, because we were London Irish. And I was brought up with all this poison. And I went to all these institutions and I slept rough and I stole. Someone said to me, "How did you get into the House of Lords?" I said, "By lying, cheating, and stealing." Because if I had not gone through that terrible self-defeat, I would never have been able to get out and learn to read and write in a boys' prison at the age of 16. And then gradually, I had a period of being a Marxist, Engelist, Leninist, Trotskyist. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. That lasted for a considerable period of time. I then became a working class Tory. I tried that for a while, and that didn't work very well. Then I tried everything. But eventually, I realized that I'd got out of poverty. I'd got into the middle classes, and the most exciting thing about being in the middle classes, which sounds remarkably rude, was how clean their beds were, and the fact they had clean underwear, and the fact that they were nice to each other. And I thought, wouldn't it be good if I could get some of the people who I grew up with and who I knew? How could I morph these people? I could not do it politically. There was not a party that could get the underclass out of the grief, the long-term unemployed, the drug users, the drunks that I came from. There was no conceivable way. When I was 21, I had the misfortune and the fortune of being hiding from the police in Edinburgh, of all places, begging. Not a very good place to beg, I tell you. No reference at all to our Scottish comrades. But what I did was I met a very large-nosed Scotsman called Gordon Roddick, who didn't have any money. And we became friends. And then he met a young lady called Anita. They got married and they started the body shop. I didn't see them for 20 years. 20 years later, I saw them on the telly and I looked at them and I had my son Paddy with me. And I said to him, "I know that big-nosed bugger." Excuse my French. And I got hold of him again and we became friends again. He said to me, "Are you one of those kind of persons who crawls out of the woodworm when somebody is incredibly successful?" And I said, "Yes." So he said, "Well, I know where you're coming from." In 1990, Gordon Roddick was in New York, and he was walking through New York, and a very large man, who he described looking like a wardrobe, came towards him. And Gordon kind of blessed himself and thought, this is it. And the bloke said, "Excuse me, buddy, would you like to buy a copy of a street paper?" And Gordon said, "Yeah, how much is it?" And he said, "It's $1. He said, "That's brilliant." He said, "I'll buy it." He said, "How does it work?" He said, "Well, I buy it for 50 cents and I sell it for $1. And he said, "So why are you doing it?" He says, "Well, I've been in and out of prison. I come from Brownsville, which is where Mike Tyson comes, and you don't get out of Brownsville without being a sportsman or without a criminal record." That was how predictable the failure was for that particular part of New York. And Gordon said, "So why are you doing it?" He said, "Well, I've got a drug habit. If I go back to where I come from, I'll be banged up again, and they'll throw the key away." So Gordon said, "This is brilliant, brilliant. So what you're doing is you're working and you're poisoning yourself, but you're not harming anybody else." And the guy said, "Yeah, I don't rob old ladies to feed my habit. I'm like everybody in Manhattan who works in the finance industry. If they want some drugs, they just ring up the dealer, which is brilliant. So Gordon came back here and he tried that. He got the Body Shop Foundation to do a feasibility study, and every one of the homeless organizations said exactly the same thing. What do you want to give money for homeless people for? They'll only do this, or put it up their nose, or put it in their arm, or do that. And that was it. Then Gordon came to me in the early part of '91, and he said, why don't you do this street paper? First of all, you've been homeless. Secondly, you're a printer. You know about magazines. Thirdly, you're a cheeky sort of chappy, and you're a great beggar and ponce. Sorry, ponce is a kind of subdivision of begging. And you don't mind. And also, you don't have one sentimental bone in your body for the poor. I don't have one sentimental bone in my body for the poor. I look upon the poor as people who, if only they could use poverty as opportunity, which it was intended for. There is nothing wrong with poverty. No longer as you can get out of it, you're going to be stronger and fitter and better. And you don't want to stay always stopping you and impeding you from getting out of poverty. You only have to scrape the surface, the patina of most people in Britain today, and you go back a few generations and somebody burnt the candle at both ends so that they could get out of the grief, and they passed that on to their children. That's what we have to kind of replicate and duplicate. We started the big issue, we ran into all the problems, and we stood up and we said, look, what we want to do more than anything is we want to give people the opportunity of making their own money. A hand up, not a hand out. And we started it. Later on, we started a charity. And what we did was we melded them together, because what we did was we helped them to get ready to become capable of finding the means of helping themselves with regard to self-help. But there were many people who couldn't get to self-help. So we held their hands, and we held them, and we keep holding them. We invest now in, my wife is telling me to wind up, so I should listen. Yeah, she's going like that. Unless, that must be the only reason for that sign. I will wind up. Let me just end on one point. The simple fact is this, that what we need to do is we need to prevent people falling down. But once they fall down, we have to have the means of getting them up as quick as possible. The Big Issue has invested in 320 businesses, social businesses around the Britain, charities, to prevent the next generation of big issue vendors, the next generation of people who are using drugs and falling through the net and causing and filling up our prisons and filling up our A&Es. Thank you very much for your patience. I was going to go on for about another hour and a half, a bit like Ken Dodd, but I will not. Thank you. God bless you all.
Follow that.